Actually, dude, the way that section of narratives is structurally designed, Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is the matching corresponding panel to the snake and the woman in Genesis 3. So the sons of Elohim, seeing that the daughters of Adam are good and they take them for themselves, is this inversion of the woman seeing that the tree was good for eating, taking for herself under the instigation of a spiritual being. In Genesis 6:4, it's reversed. It's the spiritual beings who take the women because they're good in their eyes. And so they're inversions. One is a human failure at the instigation of a spiritual being. This one is a spiritual being failure because of these women. And those two are the bookends of rebellion that necessitate the flood story. So I think they actually illuminate each other as they're like mirror images of one another. Mirror images of one another. Mirror images of one another.
Everyone out there listening to this podcast, I wish you could just see Luke and I riffing off air because we have a lot of fun. Sending memes. We get blurry. It gets blurry off on the text messages and the phone calls.
Blurry on air, blurry off air.
But thanks, Luke. You've been on this wild ride, man. You had no idea what you were getting yourself into when you said, yeah, I'll do a podcast with you, Nate.
Yeah, dude, we can talk about Bigfoot.
Here we are. Well, today we're bringing on one of the biggest dudes in the Bible verse.
In the Bible metaverse.
The myth, the man, the legend, the Mackie himself, Tim Mackie from the Bible Project.
Return of the Mackie. Except this is his first time, so that's a bad reference.
Yeah. But he gets millions of views on his YouTube channel. He tries to put the Bible in layman's terms, and people send me his videos all the time, so it's pretty cool to have him on the show. We're going to get into it today.
Yeah, he's the writer and creative director of the Bible Project, PhD in Semitic Languages and Biblical Studies, professor of Biblical Studies at Western Seminary. He's also a teaching elder at the Door of Hope Church in Portland, Oregon. And also, he likes to book things far in advance. We've been waiting for this one, Nate.
Exactly. When you're as big as Tim is, it takes a while to track you down. And we did the same thing with Heiser. We booked him out like 5 months in advance, and we've been blurrying so much. It's like flown by.
Yeah, I know.
Over 80 episodes, and here we are.
I feel like I see your beautiful face more often than not. Nate, I have no idea what the lower half of you looks like. All I see is the upper half.
I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve.
That sounded weird.
Oh. If you play your cards right, Luke.
Oh, man. This is a family show. I just meant because I see only you from like the chest up on Zoom. You idiot.
Maybe the lower half of me is just blurry.
Could be. This is a really dumb aside.
We're going to get Tim laughing because that's what we do on our show, Luke. We bring on the smart guys and get him
joking.
Dude,
I can't wait to talk about the Song of Solomon the entire time. There's some blurry stuff in there.
He probably enjoys that.
Dude, I'm going to pull that one out on him. That one I think would be acceptable. Be like, man, I'm just here to talk about the Song of Solomon. Let's just
So yeah, we're going to bring Tim Mackie on the show. He's a lot smarter than we are, Luke.
He is. It's a low bar. You're like a Mike Heiser. He's got his PhD in Semitic languages. It's like I imagine him and Mike just like talk to each other in Hebrew, and they don't even need to branch out.
If you're Tim and you're smart, you come on our show. That's how we do it.
Alberino?
That's all we look for. Is your name Tim? And are you smart?
Do you have great hair? Really good hair? Really good lettuce?
Come on.
Yeah, then your name's Tim?
Are you the Vidal Sassoon of cryptozoology? Come on, Blurry Creatures. We got some questions to ask you. Now, we're going to get Tim on the show today. He's great. We're really thrilled and honored to have him on Blurry Creatures. Once again, if you like what Blurry Creatures is doing, head over to blurrycreatures.com/members. Support the show. And we work really hard on every episode to bring you the best content. And we're recording all the time. So if you want to partner with us, help us make more content, blurrycreatures.com/members. Get access to exclusive episodes, private episodes, early episodes, and a lot more. All right, on to Tim Mackie. Welcome to the show, Tim Mackie from the Bible Project. Thanks for coming on, Blurry Creatures, so we can kind of hop into it a little bit.
Yeah.
We have one question that we ask everybody. There is no wrong answer. We've been doing it for 80 episodes now. And you live in Portland, so I know you've probably thought about it or heard about it. What are your thoughts on Bigfoot? Do you have any thoughts on this creature? And is it tied to the Bible in any way? This is just how we kick off our show. So thanks for coming on. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I no comment. No.
All right.
You know,
that's the first one. That's the first one.
I spent a lot of time in the woods. I backpack and hike a lot here in the Northwest, in the Cascades and coastal mountains. So mostly what I'm thinking about is lions.
Okay.
Because there's like thousands and thousands of them in the woods where I love to be. And
sure.
So that, to be honest, that's more what I think about. Maybe I should think about Bigfoot, but I more think about the lions that might be around.
Sure. No,
Just
we love it.
It's dude, I'm familiar with that. I've been stalked by a mountain lion.
Really?
I worked at a summer camp in Northern California in early my 20s at JH Ranch, and they sent us on this solo, and they had to come out and find us because our group was being stalked. One of the guys was up, and everybody else was asleep, and this thing would been following him back to our camp.
No joke.
Yeah, so I know all about that.
Oh,
that was pre Bigfoot days, Nate. Like I wouldn't even think about anything. Like I was just trying not to get eaten by the kitty cat out there. Yeah. So,
well, now that you've been blessed by blurry creatures, one might just come out of the woods for you, Tim.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I did. I went on a solo hike last summer, and there was like a thing stapled up to the trail sign saying recent cougar sighting on this date, you know, right where you're standing. It was like from a week earlier.
Sure.
And I always carry bear spray, but you're like, what's that really going to do?
Hey, it might do something. Better than nothing.
Anyway, it was a great hike.
It is. That's better.
Awesome.
You're back to tell about it. That's good. Yeah.
Well, hey, we appreciate you hopping into our territory, and obviously the Bigfoot thing a lot of people have they don't have any thoughts about it, so that's fine, no big deal. Yeah. We talk a lot on our show about ancient creatures, and that gets us into stories about the Nephilim and the giants. We've unpacked Genesis 6 a lot on our show, but one thing that keeps coming up is like thin places, high places, the amalgamation of heaven and earth together. Mm-hmm. And I thought it'd be really fun to talk to you about, because that's always the most confusing part on our show is there's creatures down here, and it seems like they can see our realm, but we can't really see theirs as much or as often. And trying to unpack, how does heaven and earth collide, and what does the Bible really say about that, and what are your thoughts on, then I'll get us into Eden and the heavenly host.
Yeah, great.
And all sorts of fun topics.
Great. These are some of my favorite things to ponder.
Yeah, there we go.
And the biblical authors love to ponder them too. So they gave us a lot to think about. So I'm down to talk about that. I think it's most helpful to start with the shape of the biblical cosmos that you get in the first few pages, because that it's setting literally and metaphorically the stage on which the narrative takes place.
Yeah, Genesis.
Yeah.
That's how you understand the whole Bible, we think.
Yeah, I think that's what it's there for. It's literally to set the stage. Okay, well, I'll just share some things that I've learned over the last few years. So there's a couple angles. One is to go like ancient cultural background and stuff like that. But to me, the most illuminating is to look at how the author has designed the first two, the 7-day creation story and then the Eden story. And the literary design of those two stories is a really important part of the message that they're trying to communicate, and is really illuminating about these concepts of heaven and earth. Yeah. That's a place to start.
Yeah.
Okay. You've got the first three sentences of Genesis 1. In the beginning, Elohim created the skies and the land. So there's debate about whether that's an introductory summary, and then the narrative proper begins in what follows. Even right there, the fact that the whole biblical cosmos can be referred to in one little phrase, the skies and the land. So this is a story in which it's mostly going to be about the land drama, but even the first sentence is telling you, like, this is a cosmos with two main realms that you should know about. There's the sky realm, and then there's the land realm. So that seems so obvious it doesn't need to be said. But when you really ponder that, that's telling us something profound, I think, because any reader of that is a land creature.
Right.
Because you're human. So if you're human, you're a land creature. And what that's telling you is this is a cosmos that's bigger than just the realm you perceive and inhabit. There's something bigger going on here. That's a little insight from Genesis 1:1 that really, for some reason, it just really occurred to me as an independent idea. I don't know, a couple years ago, but now it seems so basic. You're like, oh yeah, it's right, like it's right there. Then it moves on, in my view, to paint the pre-creation or the pre-ordered state, which is depicted with two images of a chaotic deep ocean and darkness, or a wild uninhabited wasteland. So the land was wild and waste, and darkness was over the surface of the deep waters. So that's the realm of disorder or non-being. And then you get the sequence of 6 days that follow of God's activity. And they follow in two triads that match each other. So you have God establishing these realms or orders of day and night, it's day 1. Then separating the waters from the waters, it's day 2. And then separating the dry land as it emerges up out of the waters. And so those are the 3 realms of the biblical world, of the sky realm, where there's night and day. Then there's the in-between realm, where what we see is the blue thing up there, which they called the rakia. And somehow that's like the semi-permeable boundary between our realm and the sky realm. And then there's the land where we are down here. And then days 4, 5, and 6 come back and they match those in order, connecting their inhabitants to each other. So day 4 comes along and matches day 1, which was about day and night and light and dark. And God delegates the governance of light and dark and day and night to creatures that are called the big light and the little light and the chochavim, the stars. And so that even just, there's a little detail right there. On day 1, God separated night, light and dark. That was the thing that God did. But then on day 4 of Genesis, God says, let the lights in the sky be for ruling the day and the night. God delegates to these rulers above. So you've got the rulers above, and they're said to rule day and night. Then God moves to the in-between realm on day 5. And that's the sky flyers and the water swarmers. So they're in the waters below, and the birds fly against the blue dome of the waters above. And then day 6 moves to the land, and it starts with animals. And then the last creature to be made, the latecomer, is the one who rules over all the creatures. And that's the image, the human image of God. And they're called the rule below. So there's an interesting kind of symmetry to days 4, 5, and 6, where you have the rulers above that correspond to the rulers below. And so the lights above are the rulers, and then you have the humans below are the rulers, and each kind of in their proper realm. And so that's unpacking that same insight from verse 1, it seems to me, where it's teaching me that there are sky realm inhabitants, and they're depicted, at least in Genesis 1, with astral imagery of the lights. And then you have the rulers of the sky realm, and they have their abode, and they are also godlike because they're images of Elohim. Oh yeah, sorry, one other detail. In Genesis 1:14, the lights are called, in Hebrew, they're called otot. And it usually gets translated as signs. It says, let them be for signs and for seasons to mark the days and years. But the word sign, it's the word symbol. Like when Moses holds up the snake on the staff, that's a symbol, it's an ot. Oh, the rainbow in the sky that God makes is an ot. It's a symbol of God's covenant loyalty. And so God calls the lights, the rulers above, he calls them otot, symbols. And you're like, symbols of what? Like a symbol is meant to stand for something. And so if they're delegated creatures who rule the night and day on God's behalf, I don't know what else that could possibly mean, except their light is a symbol of the ultimate source of light, the one who is the author of light on day 1. And similarly, the land rulers then are an image of God's rule and authority over the land, just like the heavenly ruler above. So this match between the heavenly and earthly rulers is going to be really key, foundational to understanding everything that happens within the story and its view of reality. It's mostly going to focus on land creatures, but then there will be these moments when the heaven and earth dramas are all of a sudden happening in the same place. And the biblical authors are just like,
Sure.
So like when Joshua goes into the land And he's in the book of Joshua begins, and they're about to do the famous thing of Jericho and march around. And he meets this guy who has a sword as they go into the land. And and he says to them, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the guy says, "No, it's wrong question. I'm the captain of the host of the Most High God." And so what that is it's a moment in the narrative where a land ruler, Joshua, is meeting his correspondent, heavenly ruler. That is the heavenly ruler who's going to fight on Israel's behalf, because at this moment God deems it so. So there's these moments where earth rulers meet either their partners, I guess, or they encounter, like when the moment Jacob leaves the land promised to his fathers to go in exile after cheating his dad and brother, he encounters that heaven and earth spot with Jacob's ladder, which is actually like a stairway. And then when he comes back into the land, he has a vision that his camp corresponds to a heavenly camp that's camping out in the same spot. And so he calls the place Machanayim, 2 camps, because it's my camp and God's camp are in the same spot. And so this is, I know I'm talking for a long time, so I'll throw this out here. So this is what Eden is all about. It's depicted as a high mountain garden because it's got the river flowing out of it that funds all the rivers of Babylon and Assyria, Sinai, and Egypt, all come out of Eden. And you're like, well, what? There's no river that we've known of that could possibly do such a thing. And I think that's because the point is that it's a place where heaven and earth are one. In other words, Eden is the kind of place that's telling us it's the place from which all life flows. And all the great empires of the biblical world ultimately receive their existence and life from a heavenly source. And Eden represents a type of heaven on earth reality that was possible, but that was forfeited, which is why you and I don't experience Eden. It's not because like we need to put on our backpacks and go hiking and find it. It seems to me it's the opportunity that was lost and that needs to be regained in the biblical story. So I just threw a whole bunch out there, but those for me have been some real kind of foundation posts for how I think about this whole thing.
Do you think Adam could go to and from these 2 places? Like he could go into Eden and come back out?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, so, in the narrative, the Eden narrative begins, there was no water, there was no farming, and there were no humans. So what does God do? He provides a little stream, makes some mud, he forms a human, then paws on, and then he breathes the breath of life. Then God plants a garden in the region of Eden, and then God puts the human he made in the garden. That's the order. So another little thing that stuck out to me years ago was the fact that God makes human outside of the garden. And then it's God's generous gift. The whole story gets started when he takes the human from like the dirt and puts them in proximity to something beyond themselves. And then that's the opportunity that's forfeited when they're exiled. So it seems to me that's the movement of the narrative, is that it's a story about humanity being given an opportunity to ascend into the heaven on earth place, and that the access and opportunity of what that represented was forfeited and then exile. Yeah. So in terms of him like strolling in and out, I think the narrative is more trying to say, it's kind of like this. It's kind of like, man, what if you could get in to like that concert you've always wanted to? It's the artist coming to town. And I got tickets, and then I get to the door and I left them at home and they kicked me out the door, and like, bummer. It's kind of like that. It's not about going in and out. It's like, I had the chance and I blew it and now I can't go inside.
Yeah. I got a question then, Tim. Like when you say that, it makes you think that like, it's like God took us from here into eternal life, and then we rejected that. And yet Jesus came back and redid that for us. It's almost like he opened up.
Yes.
And maybe that's what, and I don't know, people, we talked about this, like he says on the cross today, today you'll be with me in paradise. And so I've heard people presuppose that Eden is that paradise and that, but it's interesting to think about, because I hadn't really thought about the fact that was the sequence of events there, that Jesus goes back and redoes that and says, well, you forfeited your opportunity and you can't go back, but now I'm going to allow you to go back.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And he's the gate, right?
Yeah, totally. So, a couple things. When the guy getting executed next to Jesus, says, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And he says, today I'll meet you in, the Greek word is paradisos, and it's the old Greek translation of the Hebrew word garden. So the word paradisos, Jesus is referring to the garden. I'm going to meet you. We're about to go meet each other in the garden. That's what he says to the guy. And again, that's not because if you could just put on your backpack and adventure hat, you could go find Eden somewhere in like Eastern Turkey. Like that's not. The point is, it's the kind of place that has become inaccessible to us in our current mode of existence.
Totally.
But there are forms of consciousness that can make one aware of that reality. And the other claim, even though there's the spatial claim in Genesis 1 of heaven and earth, Eden is kind of flipping the image to say heaven and earth can be in the same place. And, okay, so here's a whole other rabbit hole that we can go on, is the whole impetus, the whole idea of apocalyptic visions and dreams in the Bible. Prophets having dreams and visions, and then, of course, the most famous ones of like Daniel and the Revelation and so on. But what these are moments where Jews and Christians were introduced into altered states of consciousness through prayer. Ezekiel is sitting in his house, right? Jesus goes into the wilderness and doesn't eat. And then he has this heightened awareness of the fact that heaven and earth are the same place where he is, and therefore he can have these interactions with spiritual beings, or a tester, right? The tempter. And so when Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 8, when he's in Babylon, he says, the Spirit of the Lord grabbed me by my head and took me, the phrase literally is, in between the skies and the land, in between heaven and earth. And then when the vision's over, he's sitting in his house. But he just went on a tour. So there's something about what the Bible's trying to tell us about heaven and earth that it very much has to do with our consciousness and how much of reality we are actually conscious of in any given moment. Because when Jacob goes to sleep in the field, Genesis 28, it's in his dream that he sees that heaven and earth are the same in that spot. And then once he wakes up, he can't see it anymore. So, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah. We brought on a lot of guys who talk about the megaliths and the pyramids and the structures in the high mountains. And Heiser talks a lot about Mount Hermon specifically. So it feels like there is something there where they're trying to build these things up. You know, the Tower of Babel and these stories where they're trying to access.
Yeah, that's right.
So
right.
It seems to me like there's a physicality to it as well.
I think, that's right.
Certain elevation almost.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with something that's so like woven into the human psyche, that to be up is to be in the transcendent. You have a higher vantage anytime you're up. This is actually why I like to go hiking. I just like to get on high places.
Right.
So there's something, it's not just a metaphor. It's actually woven into our experience of living on the snow globe here. And so I think, however, that physical experience, that the biblical authors see something deeper there. And when I say metaphor, I don't mean not real, but I mean they see that spatial imagery is a window into thinking about something metaphysical, that there is a way to gain a vantage point on reality that is like unto going up to a mountain. And that's why John or Ezekiel can be in their house and they can have a vision of the cosmos that's like what Moses is able to have, or Abraham when they go up onto the mountains. So I'm still working on that one about the metaphorical nature of it, or if we really, in other words, that heightened consciousness or heightened elevation on a actual place. Those might be two ways of talking about the same thing, or it might be that they're not mutually exclusive. They're two ways of, getting to those thin places.
Well, people talk a lot about like things like portals on our show. Like you can actually walk through into a dimensional, like a different dimension, like almost like a ladder. You can get from point A to point B, but you're going through, and a lot of these ancient megaliths had these doors and rocks and things.
Wow, fascinating.
And were they able to go to and from some sort of dimension, some sort of access point? And I don't know how. So I'm wondering if there's something to the high places more than just. You know more about that stuff than I do. I'm a Bible nerd.
I have a question on something that you said, and it kind of fits in this space as well. And it has to do with when I'm thinking about like the Lord's Prayer, and you talked about the reciprocity of heaven and earth, and Jesus says, here on earth as it is in heaven. You talked a bit about like the relationship, this almost symbiotic or reflective relationship of heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And Jesus speaks about it. And you can't help but think like, I mean, how do the ancients think, and how can we think in the same way about how, like the two camps, like how these things coexist? Because I think oftentimes like we think about these, you know, I don't know, it's like Paul says that what's unseen is more real than what's seen. And so there's other stuff going on. We just can't see it. But it sounds more like that the ancient Semitic people and the Hebrews and the Israelites thought that there was actually these almost like Newtonian, like for every equal and opposite action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, maybe in the spiritual realm or in the heavenlies.
Yep. It does seem like that's part of it. Maybe another angle of illumination. Well, for the Lord's Prayer is, you know, may your kingdom come and may your will be done here on the land as it is in the skies.
Sure. Okay.
So we're talking about God's purposes and demonstrations that God is the generous, wise king. I'm looking for concrete manifestations of that here on the land.
What about or what would they say binding? Like they say binding here and it's binding there.
Yeah, that's
like
right.
That as well, right? There's these.
Yeah.
Like maybe the Lord's Prayer wasn't a good one because you actually were talking about God's will. So, but the reciprocity of God's will being in heaven as it, and then having that.
That's right. Yeah, and Jesus gave us it's clear he thought what he was doing was the vanguard of that effort. So announcing good news, forming communities of mutual support that just bulldozed right over social conventions, and not always hierarchies, but sometimes, you know, that's one layer. But these acts of power and healing, reversing the power of sickness, like these were outbreaks of Eden, as it were. Yeah. They were moments of heaven and earth becoming one in somebody's body to restore it.
Do you think there's a spiritual warfare aspect as well? Like there is this, when darkness is pushed back here, then darkness is pushed back in this heavenly struggle.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating thing. So here we get some light shed from Daniel. So Daniel's praying, and the covenant people are enslaved in Babylon. Things are going bad back in Jerusalem. Daniel's praying, and you get, you know, the heavenly representative of Israel, Michael or Gabriel. I mix them up. And then he comes and he's like, yeah, you know, the Prince of Persia, you know, kept us busy for a little while, but I finally got here. That's this idea that, the global power, economic power scene matches more dimensions of reality than just the ones that we perceive and see on the news. And Jesus certainly saw the world that way. There's that little line when Jesus gets arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and in Luke's account of that, Jesus says to the guards and to the priestly representatives that are there, he says, this hour belongs to y'all and to the powers of darkness. So he sees these people coming to arrest him, representing the temple and the power brokers that are working with Rome. And he says these people correspond to what he calls the powers of darkness. And this is all through Paul's letters with what he calls the principalities and rulers. And what's so hard in Paul's letters is he'll talk about the powers and rulers that crucified our Lord. And it's actually hard. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And it's famously difficult to know, is he talking about what we would call spiritual powers? Or is he talking about the Jewish and Roman authorities? Or is it that he doesn't see these as mutually exclusive? They're mirrors, just like when Joshua meets the ruler above and the ruler below, or just like when Jesus believes he's encountering the Satan and the powers of darkness when the people come to arrest him. So it's a view that there's more to reality than what I see in any given moment. There's more to reality than what I see in any given moment. There's more to reality than what I see in any given moment. And that's just back to that fundamental insight in the first sentence of the Bible. I think that's what that first sentence was trying to tell us the whole time.
Yeah, it's like the 4D chess. It's a chess game on multiple levels, and I think that we can only see sort of this two-dimensional game. And I like what you say about Joshua. It's almost like there's a war going on, and he gets involved when he's like, okay, what's going on here? They might be actually having wars in heaven. Do you think that they're fighting like constantly?
It's a great question. You've got the thing in Daniel. The one thing that gives me pause is there's a big motif after the garden about the powers of evil being limited to the earthly realm. And even though you've got the Satan figure who's in the courts in the book of Job, and you've got the accuser up there, there's a big motif about the ruler of the world being limited to this side of the sky dome. Because if heaven is the realm where God's will is done and where his rule is perfect, then it's the rule below that has been compromised. And so that's to me, that's clear, but it does. So it's one piece, but perhaps that's just thinking within a framework of the imagery of God as the ultimate ruler above all, and there is no ultimate challenge to his will and rule. But below, it's contested space because he's given authority to creatures and allowed them to have a responsibility. And he's working in covenant partnership to take that story where it's supposed to go.
So do you think that when we talk about almost spiritual warfare, it has to happen in this realm? We may not see it, but when you talk about principalities, and you go to Deuteronomy 32 and the dividing of the nations, and these nations that gave themselves under this idol worship, which we know were real entities. Yeah. So that happens here then. So this is what I think is fascinating about the idea that there's these separate realms that exist where those that rebelled and left, it's like the fighting happens sort of here and in the air, but not in the.
It's almost just more chaotic here.
Yeah.
Well, it's not in the what would be the third heaven or however.
That's right. No, there's actually, I was just earlier this fall, I was reading. So C.S. Lewis has this great introduction to medieval Christian cosmology, views of the universe before Galileo, essentially, and Copernicus, called The Discarded Image. And it's wonderfully fun to read. But what he traces is kind of the genealogy of views of how the cosmos is structured from Plato all the way up to that medieval period. And he has a whole section on the word air and the derivation of the word air. And the word air refers to below the heavens. And this is almost certainly what Paul is talking about when he calls the Satan the ruler of the powers of the air, because within the biblical cosmos, we're in the snow globe, but above the snow globe, that is the one who is the source outside of it, but the sustainer of it all. There is no rival to that one. But in this space that he's given over to partner with, there are many wills at work. And that's why we pray for God's will to be done here, just as it's done above. So I think there may be ways to qualify that, and I won't put a dot on that, but that's kind of where my mind goes off the top of my head.
So is Satan trapped in the snow globe because they put the flaming swords? He can't get back in. It's more of keeping maybe him out of the garden.
Yeah, that's a good question. It does seem that the snake follows outside the garden, because I think the snake appears in the Cain and Abel story under the guise of a ravenous animal. God says there's an animal that wants to devour Cain when Cain's thinking about murdering his brother. And he says the crouching animal that desires you, but you can rule it, just like humans are called to rule the animals. But instead of it being called the snake, it's called sin. So you have this interesting juxtaposition in Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 of a set of parents and then their kids. And the son imitates the failure of their fathers, one at the instigation of a snake, the other at the instigation of a ravenous animal called sin. And then he murders his brother. So I do think that sin becomes like a personification of evil, or personalized evil, and that that figure keeps appearing outside of Eden as you go throughout the story. The one outlier to this is Job, but I think there's ways actually to make sense of what's going on there, but that's a whole other rabbit hole we can go down if we want to. But dude, I was thinking about this. Dude, check this out. So the way the Hebrew Bible works is narrative patterning. Later narratives are built on and pattern the vocabulary of earlier stories to tell you we're replaying that earlier story, but developing its ideas. So there's this in Genesis 26, there's this really long, repetitive story about Isaac, who keeps going out and trying to dig wells because he's trying to find water in a time of famine. And the Philistines keep like following him. And every time he digs and finds water, they either come and steal it from him, or they'll come like fill it full of rocks. So they have these three, it happens all these times. And he names the well each time in all these words of like, he named it contention or dispute. But the one in the middle that he calls it sitna, which means adversity or opposition. But it's the word Satan as a noun. He names the well sitna, which is the word Satan as a noun. So he calls the noun where brothers are almost violently coming into conflict over scarce resources. He calls it Satan. So it's a good example of a later biblical narrative, picking up the Cain and Abel, brothers at violent odds with each other. And lo and behold, the snake, the sin, and the Satan is there, but in a little wordplay of what he calls the well. Isn't that cool?
That's so cool. I'm always fascinated by like how much we lose when we are reading English.
Yeah, it is wild. And I think that's why like Paul's imagination was so shaped this way. Like even think some of his more famous lines from his well-known letters where like in Ephesians, he'll talk about don't let the sun go down on your anger. Like if you have a conflict with a brother or sister in the body of Christ, don't let the day pass because you give the devil a foothold.
Right.
And you're just like, what? Right? But that's Cain and Abel. That's division between siblings that ought to be living in unity is a place where the powers of evil, man, just get in there and you'll go to sleep fostering a little narrative in your head. They'll go to sleep with a little narrative in their head. And the next thing you know, we hate each other, you know?
Right.
And you're like, how does that happen? How do brothers become enemies? And so that's an example where the biblical authors want us to see like there's other layers of reality at work, more than just stupid humans, bumping into each other, making each other angry or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Obviously, like I wanted to ask you a little bit about, there's all this imagery of the seed of Satan himself. So there is, not only is it the idea or a noun of evil, but there is literal creatures that are supposed to be, the Nephilim were sort of the offspring, and that's what a lot of people come on our show and talk about, when the warring of the two seeds. What do you think about a lot of those topics? I'm sure it's hard.
Totally. For me, the Cain and Abel narrative is foundational for understanding the snake seed motif. So in Genesis 3, the snake, makes a ploy to deceive the humans. What's also interesting is the snakes are land creatures. So in day 5 of Genesis, the land creatures are made first and the humans come last. But yet God elevates the latecomer to rule over the first of day 6. And that sets a motif all throughout Genesis of God elevating the secondborn or the lastborn or these outsiders and elevating them to blessing and rule over the people you would think would be the chosen ones, and that are like, the firstborn or something like that. So that
would you think that's we're talking about the angelic race then, and the idea that we here are meant to rule on earth, and there's that sort of older sibling sort of creation thing?
Yeah, my hunch is that it's a similar
jealousy.
It's a little narrative nugget there that's waiting for you to, I think go that direction, which is why David in Psalm 8 is like, I can't believe you would elevate the little dirt creatures to rule over the spiritual beings. Like, why would God do that? Doesn't make any sense,
right?
Because the rulers above and the rulers below. But God wants to take these rulers below and give them eternal life and elevate them to cosmic rule. And the snake's not down for that plan, apparently.
Right.
And so that's that piece. I want to stay on focus because you have to really. So when the snake tries to usurp the human rule, he succeeds in making the humans break the divine command, but then God confronts him and the game is up. So humans are exiled, but God makes a promise, right? That a seed from the woman is going to crush the seed of the snake, even though the snake's going to get a little jab in there. So the next story is about two seeds of the woman, Cain and Abel. In terms of the narrative, you're like, oh, maybe one of these guys is one of the guys going to stomp the snake's head. Because I just learned in the previous story that's what's going to happen at some point. So these are the two best candidates you have at the moment for the snake crusher. And then the firstborn, Cain, who's the seed of the woman. You were just told he was born from her, right? But yet then he has this encounter with sin that God says is like a ravenous animal that wants you. And he makes the wrong choice, and the wrong choice leads him to murder his brother and shed innocent blood on the land. I think what that narrative is telling us is that to be the seed of the woman or the seed of the snake is not a sealed identity or a determined identity. It's an identity is demonstrated by a person's moral choices. Cain is the seed of the woman, but he becomes an agent of the snake as he allows sin to influence him and murder his brother. In other words, you aren't destined to be one or the other. It's one's moral choices that shape what trajectory you're on. I think that's the message of the story. And so when you watch Cain's 7 generations from Cain, you get Lamech, and he's chopping heads and like murdering young men and singing glorious songs about it. He's one of these violent warriors who's saturating the ground with the blood of the innocent. And then you get to the Nephilim, who are the ancient warriors of old, half human, half spiritual being, and they're soaking the ground with innocent blood. So I think it goes from Cain to Lamech to the Nephilim. And the whole thing is like a portrait of humanity that has a seed of the women that has given itself over to become the seed of the serpent. And then with the sons of God and Nephilim, which you said you've talked about plenty, so we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But it is a narrative. Actually, dude, the way that section of narratives is structurally designed, Genesis 6, 1-4 is the matching corresponding panel to the snake and the woman in Genesis 3. So the sons of Elohim, seeing that the daughters of Adam are good and they take them for themselves, is this inversion of the woman seeing that the tree was good for eating, taking her for herself under the instigation of a spiritual being. In Genesis 6:4, it's reversed. It's the spiritual beings who take the women because they're good in their eyes. And so there are inversions. One is a human failure at the instigation of a spiritual being. This one is a spiritual being failure because of these women. And those two are the bookends of rebellion that necessitate the flood story. So I think they actually illuminate each other as they're like mirror images of one another.
That's awesome. I like that. Yeah, we hadn't talked about that at all.
You can map the vocabulary really.
It's like micro and macro versions.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, totally.
Like Eden's an individual choice.
Yes, that's right.
But then like all these supposedly multiple angels decided to make this group decision to take women,
Yeah, and the result is a loss of eternal life. What God says in Genesis 6:3 is, my spirit won't dwell with man forever. And you're like, what? I thought that was already off the table after we left Eden. Like, was that back on the table? And I think that little comment is actually it's like a riddle that's meant to illuminate the motive of the sons of Elohim. So the snake wanted to get eternal life into the hands of creatures that he could have under his counsel and to live by his counsel. And then you've got the sons of Elohim who are making another bid, eternal life for these creatures that they want to spawn as little images of themselves. I think that's what's going on in the way those narratives are juxtaposed. But the larger point is, I know there's some people who get really into the seed of the woman and the seed of the snake.
Us.
And well, actually, instead of painting that, I'll just say my view is that the seed you're a part of depends on how you respond to the divine guidance that one receives. And Cain sets that pattern. And so it's why Jacob in the Jacob stories, Jacob is born grabbing the heel, snatching the heel of his brother. So he's the younger, grabbing the heel. And the word heel occurs like 4 times in Genesis. And every one of them is networked back to the crushing of the snake and the snake getting the heel of the seed of the woman.
Mm-hmm.
But Jacob is born a snake. He's born a heel grabber. That's what his name means. His name means heel grabber. And so the whole Jacob narrative is about how God's chosen him, and he's got to turn this snake back into a human so that he can actually work with him. And so Jacob has to go through all this suffering that he brings by deceiving other people, just like the snake deceives the woman. Anyway, so it's a good example where Jacob is a snake, but God's trying to turn him into a human. And that's the drama of the Jacob story, it seems to be.
The seraphim have this serpent vibe, right? This whole like,
yes.
Is that what you suppose? We don't know. Suppose that, I mean, it could very well could have been a real serpent, or do you think? What do you think about that?
Yeah, totally.
That in relation to what we know about the accuser and Satan in this sort of the whole spiritual thing. Do you think that that's like a seraphim vibe, or do you think that there's really like some sort of metaphysical like inhabitation of this actual animal? Like what? I mean, this is something we don't know, but I'm curious.
Totally.
Like, your thoughts.
I should say about all this stuff, like, don't confuse me for somebody who like really knows what all of this is actually about.
You got the 10,000 hours, man. So we're gonna lean on you here.
No. What I'm talking about is like, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand all this biblical imagery and how it works together and makes sense. So I'm happy to talk about that. But when I'm saying like the next step, which is like, what would I actually meet if I were to wake up in a heaven and earth spot, and what would I see? Like, my mind's filled with this imagery. So I can't, but to that point, whenever people have visions of these guardian boundary figures who stand at the boundary of heaven and earth, so they're called by a variety of names: the host of heaven, malachim, which is the Hebrew word messengers. It gets translated angelos and angels in Greek. You get the word cherubim, which is the ancient Near Eastern shared word that Hebrew has with other Semitic languages for these boundary figures. And then you get seraphim. That's the main vocabulary for it in the Hebrew Bible. Seraphim is the interesting one because it only occurs once in the Hebrew Bible, and that's in the prophet Isaiah's vision, where he wakes up in an altered state of consciousness, and he's in the Holy of Holies, which is nowhere where he would be allowed to be actually. So he's clearly having an Ezekiel, like in between heaven and earth kind of vision. And when he describes the boundary guarding creatures, he describes them differently than how Ezekiel sees them, and differently than how they're depicted in the temple and tabernacle, because he sees them with 6 wings. Ezekiel sees 4 wings. Isaiah's have 6 wings. And so the point is that when people have these encounters, they describe the same basic features, but with different details. So in the tabernacle and temple, they were drawn with 2 wings. In Ezekiel's vision, they have 4. And they're called cherubim. And in Isaiah's, they have 6 wings. They have 4 faces in Ezekiel.
Wow.
They're only described as having no face because their face is covered in Isaiah. Are you with me? So it's sort of like this is somehow they're encountering a reality that's so overwhelming. They all have slightly different ways of even trying to describe what they encountered. But what they all encounter is a guardian between heaven and earth. Isaiah's depiction in particular, he uses the word seraph, which is the Hebrew word for snake. When God sends snakes to bite the Israelites in the wilderness, they're seraphim.
Flying snakes.
They're seraphim. Yeah. So it seems to me that the reader of the Hebrew Bible, which is not meant as a simple linear forward read, it's meant for meditation and rereading so that you bring everything you learned from the ending all the way back to the beginning again. And so by the time you get to Ezekiel, and he talks about a rebel cherub in the garden, I don't think you're supposed to be surprised. I think you're supposed to be like, yeah, that's right. That it was a snake, and it was a snake. It was disguised as a snake. And dude, this is the whole motif in Genesis, the disguised deceiver. Just try and think of how many people disguise themselves in order to deceive other people in the book of Genesis alone. And that itself is all little narrative patterning in Genesis, patterned after the first disguised deceiver that is the snake.
Yeah, it's like Esau.
So cool.
It's like he makes himself beast-like.
or rather, Jacob dresses up like an animal to imitate his beast-like brother.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
exactly
Imagine,
right. That's right.
imagine being that hairy.
It's
that
like
poor
a
guy.
beast.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But also Tamar dresses up. Joseph disguises himself from his brothers in order to deceive them, to get them to tell the truth about what they did to him. So it's a whole motif in Genesis that takes you back to the snake, and you're like, there's more going on there to that guy.
So a question for you, if there's so much biodiversity down here between animals, creatures, land, fruits, species, do you think the same is mirrored in heaven? There's that many creatures in that realm, you think?
That is a great question.
Wow.
I know that there's not a lot in the Bible. There's a variety of vocabulary that I just talked about. There's the messengers, there's the seraphim, there's the cherubim, and then there's the host of heaven, or the sons of Elohim. So what's that? 5 different terms. And then when you get to Paul has a developed vocabulary for talking about hierarchies, because his core metaphor is the divine court. Thinking of a divine throne room and different tiers of commanders and advisors.
Archons.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I think the trick is like, this is all, but mostly these are titles based on types of function as opposed to like what we might say species. So that's one piece of the puzzle. I know that later Christian and Jewish thinkers meditated on this a lot. And there were many thinkers that came to the conclusion that there was a fixed number because they have an immortal identity. And so they don't have natures the way that we do, that evolving, developing life and species would be something limited to us creatures that live in only 4 dimensions. I've thought about it, and I'm sure there's a lot more intelligent stuff to say about that question. I just don't know what it is.
That makes sense to me, because we don't get any information that there are like female angels. So the idea of reproduction as we understand it, especially with eternal beings, there didn't seem like there'd be.
It's true. Yeah. Jesus makes that comment that like somehow it's going to work different. And that would make sense in terms of if life outside of Eden is life where there's competition for resources, right? Where we're serving the ground flourishes at our expense, right? It takes our lives. And we live at the expense of the plant and animal kingdoms. They die so that we can live. And so it's this idea of this transcendent dimension of reality. Beings can exist, but not at each other's expense.
Well,
and
that seems
to be the portrait of the sky realm. And I think we're here to what if those 2 realms merged? Then you'd have resurrection bodies where you can live, but without at the expense of creation. You just are sustained by the life and power of God and love. At least I think. Yeah. But we're going about as far as my meditations have taken me.
Well, how does the tree of life fit into that question? I mean, if we ate from, is that an intrinsic thing where if we got eternal life from eating of that tree, we actually gain something from it?
Oh, that's a good, I think the tree of life is a powerful, ancient, iconic image for God's own life. Because as you follow, what's the best way to frame that? Maybe one is this: when God breathes into the mud creature, he becomes nefesh chaya, living creature. So this creature is alive. But then when you go up to Eden, he's offered the tree of life. And in the narrative, if you just think narratively, you got to stop and ponder that. You're like, he's already alive. That's the only reason that human's a creature anyway. So there's life, and then there's the center of the garden life. There's life at the center of the garden. And the narrator is really specific to tell you that tree is at the center. So you got the land, Eden, the garden, the tree of life. And then as you go on in narrative patterning, like when the tabernacle, all the blueprints are described, the matching corresponding spot symbolically in the tabernacle is where the ark is located. and it's interesting, even though the tabernacle is like a 2/3, 1/3, the Holy of Holies is the back 1/3, but it's called the middle. Yahweh says, and I will dwell in the middle of them. You're like, well, it's a little off center. It's like, no, you're missing the point. So I think that the tree of life, Lady Wisdom is a tree of life in the book of Proverbs. You can take from wisdom in Proverbs 1 and 3 and take from the tree of life, which means to participate in God's own wisdom and life. So I think it's an image for taking of God's own, participating in God's own life to a degree that like it's like an upgrade from my current experience of life. That's at least where I'm at.
Well, I mean, it would seem to me, I guess my thought is this, that everything down here is like a little vision into who God is, really. I think that we have beautiful fruit trees here. And I don't wonder why would God litter this area with these fruit trees if he didn't have one? If he didn't have one himself?
Yeah, I hear that.
Because I used to think that it was sort of a symbol and an image and a thought, and now I'm thinking it could be both things. It could actually be a tree, and it could also be Lady Wisdom.
Yeah, yep, I hear that.
But I don't know.
You know, what's so funny is to think in terms of the history of Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox debates about like what is the bread and cup, for example. We're almost to the same conversation, right?
Exactly.
In other words, the biblical authors view physical reality as the place where we get glimpses of heaven in these depictions of having a meal in the tent with joy. These kinds of things
become like metaphysical. It's
totally Abraham meeting with the three men under the tree, right? These kinds of things, and every man sitting under his own vine and fig tree. So I'm with you, Nate. I think the biblical authors would have a lot more in common with a more sacramental view of reality that our Orthodox and Catholic brothers and sisters have been saying for thousands of years, like, come on guys, tune in.
Tim, to that point, I had a question because you kind of touched on it a couple of times on your thoughts on this. Like, we talked about how Daniel and Ezekiel and they had these experiences where they were able to transcend into the spiritual realm. And we know the opposite happens too, that like with Abraham and the three men, and we have the angels that walk into Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And they access it back. Like,
what exactly do you mean they access it back?
Like they're able to come here,
I see.
And then
I see.
And we're able to come there like through prayer or dreams, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to get to that in a second as well, but I kind of want to talk about the flip side of the interaction of that realm coming here. And we have the ladder and those kind of things happening. Like, how do the ancients? Did they just think this is commonplace and just happens? They can come here but we just can't go there. Essentially,
that's a good question. It doesn't seem like anybody in the Bible feels like it's commonplace, because when they have these encounters and they realize what's happening, the people freak out.
Yeah, that's right. Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid.
Totally. Right? Yeah. So, I mean, even, in the book of Acts, there's the high density of stuff going on in those first, but even, we can read it in the span of an hour and a half, but we're covering like the first few, almost like a decade in those early chapters.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they have free access? Like, do you think that it's a permission thing?
Oh, well, the word angelos, we translate as angel, corresponds to the Hebrew malach. It means messenger. So it seems like it's more on when there's a mission, the messengers are sent and there's a purpose. And there's that little line in Hebrews where he says, always practice hospitality, because
he's going to be entertaining angels.
Yeah. And
the Newsboys reprised that at one point.
Yeah, and that's somebody whose mind has been shaped by the Abraham entertaining the angels and Lot as well. Right. That there are times when my life can overlap with the divine mission that God's working on, which means I could encounter a messenger, and I shouldn't rule that out. when I'm like going about my day to day.
Right.
I need to think about that a lot more than I do. Probably.
So my thing is like, say they're messengers, and I like that line of thinking. Like there's this permission, or there's this mission, there's this purposeful sending, right, of the interaction of really of heaven and earth, of these two realms. And when we talk about the prophets of the Bible and Revelation and John having these dreams, and then in Ezekiel, what do you think about people that try to access this? Like without that, like so ayahuasca or DMT, these are things that like people talk about in our narrative, in our common conversation, our societal conversation, and that stuff is weird to say the least. Just because, but people claim to like access this, and who knows? I mean, the spiritual plane,
necromancy, and all these things.
Man, this is very ancient. This is humans who don't have a totally materialistic worldview. And by I don't mean consumerism, right? But I mean in the modern kind of philosophical sense,
like academic or secular. sense, right?
Yeah. So that's an anomaly in in the history of human thought, a materialistic view of the world. It's always been there, even going back to the time of the Greek philosophers, but it's always been a minority. So if you're not limited to your view of reality by that, you believe there are more dimensions to reality than meet the eye, which is a fairly intuitive way to see reality, then there's no monopoly here of like the biblical story or the Jewish Christian tradition here. But the way it seems to me the biblical authors want to contribute to that through the category of false prophets is to say our encounters with ultimate reality are relational, and so can be remade in the image of our own imaginations and desires, such that we think that we're encountering someone other, but what we're really doing is projecting our desires into the heavens. And how do you know you're not just projecting your own personal Babylon up into the heavens and then saying, like in Jeremiah, I had a dream, thus says the Lord, And so the biblical, this is a huge problem in the early church and in ancient Israel, was like, who do you know who really stood in the counsel of Yahweh? And the one mark of the biblical prophets that Jesus saw himself in line with is they spoke truth to corrupt, distorted organizations of human power. They were marked by faithfulness unto suffering, and they rejected worldly power. And they rejected worldly power.
Wow.
Yeah. It also seems like they're trying to manifest it. Like instead it came and grabbed them, right? God came and got them.
Humility.
Totally. Oh yeah. Jeremiah wishes he had never been born. Yeah. He's like, I hate my job.
Right. So that's what I think. When I think about it, it's like the idea of seeking it out.
Totally. Yeah. That's
for the experience.
Yeah.
The worldly way to try to, but really like when it's God, it comes and finds you.
Yeah. So I guess the point there is just even within Jewish Christian traditions, I think the biblical story would want us to be just as suspicious of ourselves or my Christian neighbor or my non-Christian neighbor and all of our interactions with what we think is the divine. Or at least to be self-critical and not just assume because I had a powerful experience, whether through meditation or psilocybin, or whatever, that somehow then I actually saw reality the way it really is. And for the biblical authors, our minds are like this battleground for clarity or something like that.
Well, I just don't think there's a lot of nuance. Like it's either truth or deception, right? And I think that's the problem, is that this in-betweener thing, people want nuance. Like you can just sort of be a spectator instead of, and I really think it's just, I mean, from what you're saying, what I think is that it's either truth, and that truth comes from God, or it's deception.
Yeah.
And there's really two buckets. But I don't know. I don't pretend to know.
You know, there may be one other angle here that you mentioned, was that the biblical prophets, and it seems that even Jesus had these moments where his encounters with in prayer, you know, the voice that and person that the prophets are interacting with speaks back. And like, it's not just a projection of your desires onto the skies, because it like talks back and makes you do and say stuff you don't want to do and say. You know? Right. Even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's like, Father, I really don't want to do this. You know, like that scene is really powerful, because that's precisely the moment where we can reflect back on the story and see there was no moment where Jesus was more in tune with the will of God than in the Garden of Gethsemane. And yet that was the very moment where he began to experience the absence of God, right? And praying these prayers that aren't realized, that because he doesn't want to, and he has to just submit himself to the mystery of God's purpose, even though it's not what he wants. And that seems more characteristic of Jesus-style encounters with ultimate reality.
Wow. This seems like the flip side of the Genesis story, what we started the conversation with, which is like, you can become like God. You can transcend past human to this other realm. You could be great. And then you have guys like John the Baptist who are out in the woods eating bugs, right? And that's the guy that's going to baptize Christ.
Yeah.
So it's it's that mirror thing, right? Ultimate humility, maybe some suffering, and then maybe even a guy that doesn't want to do the job. That's the resume.
A guy with a stutter to go talk to Pharaoh. Right?
Yeah, totally.
I would say obviously David was a badass. You know, he wasn't.
Yeah, sure. He was also a deeply flawed character. And it's hard in the story to know if what he's doing in any given story is just his own will or God's will, or a little mix of both. And that's what makes his story so fascinating, is because he's such a complex character.
In the snow globe.
See ourselves in it too.
Totally. That's like describes my everyday.
Right, exactly. What does Luke want?
Yeah, You know, I just wanted to go on a quick note though, to say in my own journey, the habits and practices of daily silence, of centering prayer, or prayer that's focused on making me present to the moment and the presence of God's Spirit. These have actually been the most life-giving discoveries for me in middle age. So like, I think there are experiences to be had for us when we sit and pause to open ourselves to ultimate reality. But the challenge I've always had with those experiences too is I don't know at what moment I'm in the echo chamber and what moment I'm really connecting with something outside myself. And I think that's the challenge that we all have. But that's a challenge I don't think that's unique to us, because the prophets had their own struggles with that too, which is comforting to me.
Search me and find me, right?
Yeah, like totally.
You gotta be a sieve to that. Yeah.
Anyway. So with that, what's one of the harder stories for you to believe in the Bible then?
Oh man. Difficult. Yeah. That's
that war between that David had, right?
Yeah.
Like which one is it?
Yeah, totally. Well, you know, a habit I've been getting into in the last few years is just to move towards all the parts of the Bible that made me uncomfortable, like this. So, and even though like I've worked through with what I think is a coherent and historically appropriate understanding of like the sons of God and Nephilim, it's hard. It's hard for me. And the talking snake is still hard for me. You know, that one threw me right when I was a brand new Christian. So those are some. For me, it's the portraits of divine violence. And when God employs Israel as a tool of divine justice on certain people groups. Those are narratives that I feel like I just need to sit with for a lot more time. Mm-hmm. But right now, those probably are the biggest source of like, I know I don't know what I need to get about those yet because they really bother me. And maybe they'll always bother me, even if I do begin to understand them more.
What if they weren't people groups? What if they weren't people?
Ah, right. Totally. Yep. I'm tracking.
I thought, Tim, I thought you were going to say Song of Solomon. That's a tough one sometimes, It's if you were
No, that's the best one.
There he goes.
That is the bit, right? Yeah, it's like
Such a
if
dude
if you're a Jewish boy under the age of 12, you weren't gonna see
totally.
that.
Yeah.
So, wait, go back real quick.
Yeah.
Could Satan had possessed the snake, put his spirit into the snake, and the snake was actually possessed by him? So it was a snake, but it was also Satan. Could that be possible?
Yeah. My only hang up is with our words possession, because I think there's connotations there that might cause us to introduce some distorting elements. Because what Isaiah sees is he calls it a snake. That's what the word seraph means, snake. And so there's this category for a spiritual being that's a boundary guardian creature that can appear in the form of a snake. And so whatever Eden is, it's not a normal kind of place. There's nothing, and by normal, I'm talking about my experience of reality. So my hunch is we're meant to see something more than just a possessed snake. That's my hunch, at least. But I wasn't there.
Right.
So I'll wait with you, Nate, to see what's ultimate. But maybe, is there something underneath that for you that is kind of important, that's driving that question? What's underneath that for you?
Well, I tend to think that both and is where I'm at with my understanding of most of these stories.
Yeah.
Both and.
Yeah.
And I think earlier on in my understanding of the Bible, it was one or the other. And so I could see it. Someone presented on our show recently that seraphim had the ability to possess. Like, how did Satan possess Peter? And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Some say, well, in a literal sense, Satan could put his spirit in other people, beings. He could take over things and people, but also remain embodied as an entity.
Yeah, I hear that.
And so the demons are the disembodied version of that. They want a body.
Yeah.
Right? So they do possess people. They do get into bodies.
Yeah.
Well, they wanted the pigs, right?
Yeah, totally. Yep.
So Satan could have possessed a snake if
I hear that.
you follow that line of logic. But I don't know. I don't know. But
Yeah,
for me,
that's right. I think I prefer the term influence just because the word possession to me is a mark of belonging. And the fact that powers of evil can influence somebody who belongs to the Messiah.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? In other words, I would tend to use possession to talk about like identity in the Messiah. I belong to the Messiah. I'm possessed by Messiah, but I can be influenced by all kinds of crazy stuff. The flesh, the world, and the powers of evil. And that happens to people who follow Jesus and who don't follow Jesus. So that might be nitpicking, and I'm not trying to nitpick because I think your point's a good one, is that these are non-physical realities that influence physical beings. And if a human, why not an animal? I guess that's
right.
to your point, right, Nate?
Yeah, we have talking donkeys and other crazy stories in the Bible, right? So
that's the one.
Tim, I've got one last question, and it's in this vein.
Yeah.
And we talked about Isaiah, and we talked about Ezekiel and what they saw. And there's a lot of people that we've even on the show that talk about what they saw is it's prophetic iconography. They're talking about symbolism to describe these things. Where do you fall on, like, do these things have six wings, or are they just trying to convey a message, or are they literally just trying to describe something they can't describe? And I don't know if there's a good answer to that, but like some people will just say, "Oh no, that's not it. That's all. The four faces, it just has to do with is prophetic iconography. They're talking about these aspects of this and that, and it's not really four faces. And the beasts around the throne aren't really beasts. There's just a way to prophetically describe something so that people, in an esoteric way, people would understand, or maybe seek to understand what it is they're really seeing."
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. So if we're talking about an apocalyptic vision that's a result of a heightened state of consciousness, then it's difficult to even say, was it really this? Or did they just see that? Because the whole nature of that experience is subjective. because it's consciousness, first person consciousness is subjective awareness. It cannot be otherwise. And so if my consciousness is heightened through a dream or a vision to encounter ultimate reality, what Isaiah saw and encountered was what he described. And what we want to know is, but what is it really?
Right.
Outside of the subjective consciousness of Isaiah, that it's like the thing that really is. And I don't know, man. I'm comfortable just saying that's what he encountered. And here's what Ezekiel encountered.
Right. Four wings, they're growing wings. Just a little time difference, right? Yeah.
And the fact that they use different language, I think, speaks to the fact that they're two different people. And like Ezekiel grew up around the temple, around all this imagery constantly as he trained for the priesthood. Isaiah wasn't a priest. And so he has a whole different life experience. And so what he will see and what really is for him, the thing that he encounters, will appear differently. Okay, this is whole philosophy of body and mind stuff that I'm just an amateur in. But the ways reality, to a large degree, as I encounter it, is the result of my brain constructing it into something meaningful so that I can exist, and like move through my life. And that doesn't mean that there's no reality. It just means that how I describe it and experience it is as it's reciprocal with my brain constructing it. And so when you talk about what I would see if I saw ultimate reality, and I think it would be different than what they saw, but it would be influenced by it because I've immersed myself in this view of reality too. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it's not a shared. It's not a shared experience, right? So that's I think that's what you're saying is that like it's so subjective because when an individual trying to convey what how they perceive the things that were revealed to them, and because it's not a shared experience, we don't have it's like a single eyewitness to something. And when you have eyewitnesses, even multiple to the same thing, they describe stuff differently, right? It's that whole paradigm that's
right. And the fact that there are variations doesn't mean nothing happened.
100%.
And it doesn't mean there's no ultimate reality. It just means we aren't given. I mean, it's just the nature of being a human is that we're finite and subjective.
Dude, we're just like just quantum brain exploding stuff right now. This is crazy.
Yeah.
Kind of makes me think of something you were saying a little earlier. That's where my mind was going, of the people being freaked out whenever the angels did appear, whenever we interacted. And even when Christ is in his resurrected body, we see him differently. And do you think, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the transfiguration of Christ, that maybe when they saw these beings, they were almost in some sort of human form, but they were radiating. And when Christ goes to the transfiguration, he shines. What do you think is going on there? What do you think the significance of him shining is in that moment?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is the narrative patterning. They go up to a high mountain.
Yep.
There's a cloud and a divine voice. So we're clearly creating a Moses and Sinai thing. And of course, Moses appears along with Elijah, who also went to Mount Sinai and encountered a cloud and so on. So there's something about Jesus being the greater than Elijah, the greater than Moses. But there's also something about the fact that in Moses's experience up on Sinai, he himself has a vision. And it's what God calls the tavnit or the mar. It's what God shows him, the pattern of the tabernacle. And the word the word pattern means like a building pattern. But the verb for what is shown you, is you saw it. He had visions up there. And the central vision of the tabernacle blueprints is 2 long chapters describing a shining high priest figure wearing a crown and all of these jewels with radiating white shiny garments. There was a whole Second Temple Jewish text that explored what Moses saw. It's called the Apocalyptic of Moses. And it's all about how he ascends into the heavens and sees the Son of Man of Daniel 7, but dressed like a high priest. So I think this narrative is making a claim that it's like a flash of Jesus's true identity as the cosmic royal priest, as the Daniel Son of Man, who's going to ascend to the heavens and rule heaven and earth together, I think. And it's like a flash of his true identity, and then it's withdrawn from them. And Peter starts talking about making tabernacles.
It's also the law and the prophets too. There's all that symbolism there.
Totally.
Too.
Yeah, that scene is loaded, man. There's so many layers. But I think the point is it's another good example of how there is a way of seeing Jesus where you can remain completely blind to who he really is and yet be one of the people that like walked and talked with him. But then with these other moments that a story like that tells us that there were some disciples that had moments with Jesus where they saw heaven and earth overlap in him. And I think that's what I think that's what the story is about.
Dude, what a good cap to the end of this interview though, because there's heaven and earth in
one person. Yeah.
I mean, I just keep thinking of Field of Dreams when they can't see the Field of Dreams. They just can't. And then they can.
Yes.
And then that moment they can.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. The analog to this in Luke's account is at the very end with the two on the road to Emmaus. And they're walking with Jesus. And as long as they think he was a failed crucified Messiah, they can't see him. But then the moment he breaks the bread, he blesses it and breaks the bread just like he did at the Passover supper, then their eyes are open. And they're like, oh my God, like, you're the suffering servant Messiah. And the moment they see him, he's gone. And so it's like to really see Jesus' identity itself is a whole journey of growth, just like learning to see my life as a venue where heaven and earth are one. And even then, I feel like I just get glimpses, But
wow, Tim, thanks so much, man. Thanks for coming on our show. And
thank you guys. This is really this might have a good time.
Yeah, ours too.
But also, this is stuff that I think about a lot too. So I appreciate people of kindred spirit who want to ponder important things.
The weird stuff is what we do on our show. It just gets weird.
Yeah, we like the weird stuff.
Sweet.
Weirder and weirder.
We run that direction.
Yeah.
Nate, as opposed to
and what's maybe some future plans for you and how people can connect with what you're doing. Obviously, you've got a huge show. So, I'm working with Bible Project, and I think the thing we're excited about right now, we released an app earlier this month, at the beginning of the month, which is the beginning of 2022. And what we're doing is creating really designed interactive Bible reading experiences, trying to teach people how to read biblical literature in a way that's kind of more native to its design. And so I'm working, we kind of built our scholar team, added some other biblical scholars and colleagues. And so we're just crawling through the Torah right now and going through section by section, thinking, how would we take somebody on a tour of this section of Numbers? And dude, it's so fun, man. So that's a big thing we're cooking up. And we have classroom classes we're filming and releasing. And
is that app available now? Like,
go to.
Oh, I'm gonna check it out. Yeah.
There's the Apple App Store, and then there's the non-Apple App Store.
Love it.
It's available on the Android. It's available on the
Well, Tim, this has been great. I mean, a part of me didn't want to prepare for this show because I wanted it to be super organic and go wherever it wanted to go. And this is kind of exactly how I thought it would go. And you were really easy to talk to, really down to earth, and
likewise,
tons of passion.
Yeah.
Thanks for the time, man. Totally appreciate it.
Yeah. So welcome. Totally happy to take the time.
And love to have you back. We'll probably reach out and book it for next year. So we can
Cheers.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, man.
Great. All right, Nate and Luke. It was nice to meet you guys.
You too, man.
You too, Tim.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for the time.
Yep. All the best for the rest of your day.
Thanks, man. That was rad.
All right, Nate. That was super cool.
Sometimes you just gotta trust your gut and go for it, bro.
It's kind of crazy. It's like having a conversation with like a buddy almost. Just a buddy that's way smarter than I am.
Right?
It'd be good to have him in a hyzer and just be a fly on the wall, listen to him talk about Torah.
Sometimes you think about these guys and you're like, it feels like the academics, like they just need someone who just doesn't think that way almost. Like, I don't think anything like these people. So it's fun to talk to them, and then every once in a while a question will land and you're like, all right, thinking weird helps.
Yeah, it does.
But then they kind of fill in all the little details that you miss, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the story of the road at the end of the podcast. So anyway, really enjoyed him. He's cool.
Yeah.
I feel like we tiptoed around the blurry stuff, but it didn't derail it.
No, I think it was awesome to kind of like fill in some context and talk to somebody who's so vested in the original languages to talk about the blurry stuff. I think that's an important part of it, right? Like that we talk about this all the time, but to go back and view the world and view the scriptures as the ancients did. I mean, we talk about this all the time. When we have Derek Olson on of Megalithic Marvels, and we talk about the old stuff that people can't explain. You realize there's so much that was lost.
I really loved how he held Genesis 6 because you could kind of tell that he has struggled believing it, where I don't at this point, but some people do, especially if you've been classically trained.
You definitely don't.
I don't. But to watch him, it's sort of, you could see it in his eyes that he was struggling to understand it. But the way he described it was so beautiful that the sons of God mirror the eating of the forbidden fruit. I really like that part of the episode.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's super cool to have somebody that also has done so much work on structure. Mm-hmm. We don't think about this in the Bible when you have these brilliant narratives that mirror each other, purposefully, right? Mm-hmm. And you have these stories that are arranged purposefully. It's not that they were contrived to do that. It's that they were arranged, and I always think divinely arranged too in Chronos, in time, by God to also be reflection. So I think all that stuff makes your mind explode, but it's also so divinely brilliant. I don't get to see that. I don't think I'm smart enough. I don't get to see this that often, like to get a glimpse that often. It's really cool to take a few minutes and in this podcast and take a look at things through someone who completely has a great grasp on that.
That's probably why we're chatting right now. It's probably why we're having an after show conversation, because it puts your mind at ease. You almost feel like your spirit is ready to ponder these things. It takes a while to warm up. It's like working out, right? You get to a place where it's easy. It flows out of you. And that's kind of where I feel right now. Like I want to keep talking about it. But obviously, this time is valuable and we respect it. And we appreciate all you guys out there listening to the show, sharing it with people. Blurry Creatures is taking a cool road, a cool route. And I love these conversations, man. This is fun. Something I would be doing anyways. I was talking to Dr. Judd about it. I was like, the thing that we do, I think, is we're just documenting our own journey. These are the videos I'd be watching anyways, right? This is where my mind would be anyways. So might as well document it. And sometimes I feel like a dummy, but it's like I feel like a dummy when I'm watching the video. So might as well record it and put it out there.
Just be a dummy all the time.
Yeah.
Don't break character.
Yeah, exactly. We're not trying to acquire all the knowledge and then present it as if we're smart. We're just, I'm going to watch Tim Mackie's videos. Might as well be the dummy asking him the questions live, right? So,
right.
Anyway.
It's a privilege.
Blurry Creatures. Yeah. Who knew? And what do we do?
Who knew, except that it's that time right now, Nate, to roll that time.